These are either mistakes that I've made personally or have seen others make. And if you can avoid them, I think they'll be, very valuable and will save you millions. And I'm not exaggerating. Like you can, making these mistakes could easily cost you millions. So obviously if you avoid them, you'll save that. So the first is what I think is probably the biggest issue, and that is being overly optimistic, or what I call blue sky thinking. And I mean, there's just so many stories that I could think about, but I'll give you one that kind of resonates most with me. And that is in 2022, like say January, like a year ago today, we were starting on a project and we were running different sensitivities. And sensitivities are basically like bandwidths. And one of them was interest rates, right? And we had plugged in kind of where we thought interest rates could go to. And if I go back and I look at that underwriting, and I mean, obviously no one could tell where interest rates would go. But I do remember having a conversation with one of my investors, and he says, what happens if interest rates go to 10 or 12 or 15%? And I just thought that was like completely crazy. And I remember saying to him, I said, look, if you think interest rates are going to go to 10%, then you should not invest in this deal, because the deal will die at 10%. I will just tell you that. But I knew that intuitively, right? But I never believed that they could get that high. Now, fast forward a year, one of our lenders, a little bit more expensive, but still like what would be considered a tier one lender, like a credit union or bank, they're at 8% on a construction loan. And so to say 10% seemed crazy a year ago, but today 10% doesn't seem nearly as unrealistic, right? And so sometimes having that kind of outside perspective, someone that doesn't have what I call a horse in the race, meaning they're just there to help you. They're not there to influence your decision for their benefit. Okay. So oftentimes that requires an outside perspective. Usually if you're in the deal, you're a little too close, and it's, you want to do the deal. And so you're going to look for reasons to do it. So the first one is being overly optimistic or blue sky. The second is having too low a margin of safety. This is something Warren Buffett talks about a lot, and I won't get into the specifics of margin of safety necessarily, but what my brother-in-law, Graham, told me right when I was getting into doing real estate developments is this concept of doubling time and doubling your costs. And that is another piece of advice that most developers will never really kind of follow through to the end. Because if you double the amount of time that it's going to take to do your project, I can tell you that it will definitely scare you. And just one line item on your pro forma, which is your interest reserve, because as you're doing a development project, you have no income. So if you think the project is going to take you 12 months, but it takes 24 months, or it's going to take 18 and it goes to 36, then you've got to essentially, look at what that interest reserve is going to do to your cash flow over that duration. And I can tell you, especially if you're going into a new market, a new project, if there's new planners, there's new council, new architect, whatever it happens to be, it can definitely, your timeline can expand much further than you probably initially thought. So that's another big issue that I see. The third is having the wrong team. And, part of your team when you're a developer is going to be your architect, all your consultants, like your engineers, civil, structural, mechanical, electrical, your general contractor, as well as obviously all the people that the general contractor hires, right? All the sub-trades and suppliers. I'm going to focus on consultants because I never appreciated it until most recently that having the wrong consultant on a project could have such a huge impact. And the reason for that is your consultants, when we analyzed all the consultants, we kind of thought that they were like, you organize them almost by price, right? This guy comes in 10,000 less than the next one, so let's go with the cheaper one. Well, the challenge with that is if they are difficult to work with, if they have too big of an ego, if they don't understand what the end goal is, it's very easy for them to drive your project into the ground. And I've seen this now twice. and I am hypersensitive on who I will work with on a go forward basis. And what that means typically is, the architect and the GC, do they get along? And then inside of that, has that general contractor had experience working with these different consultants? Because they're the ones that are going to be interacting on a very frequent basis. And if they don't get along, I can just tell you, it costs you a lot of money, a lot of headache, and that's where projects get stretched out. Okay, so that's the third one. Number 4 is underestimating contingencies. And I used to, until it becomes a problem, you never actually think about it. The way I would phrase this is that a 10% contingency on 10 million is a $1 million contingency. Okay, that's probably okay. 10% on 2 million is only 200,000, right? And some people are running with 5% contingencies, right? So 5% on 2 million is 100 grand. Here's where I feel that the mistakes get made. Often in a development, like there's kind of a joke that there's like no change order is less than 50,000 or 25,000 or whatever the number is, but it's a big number, right? We're not worried about $500 issues. We're worried about $50,000, $100,000, $500,000 issues. And in development projects, the numbers are usually quite large. So what happens is on smaller projects, when you're running with like a 5% or 10% contingency, that can get chewed up in like 2 mistakes. When you have a bigger project, oftentimes there will be issues that come up, but you've got a much larger contingency to handle it. And so what I've learned, especially doing smaller projects, is to not look at the percentage, but look at how big my contingency is that I'm carrying, to make sure that I can, it's a gut check. Like I'm looking and saying, is this enough money to carry me through if I have an issue with civil, if I have an issue with this, you just go down the list. Okay, so the size of the contingency is more important than the percentage in my experience. And the last one is your underwriting model. And meaning oftentimes what happens is developers, and I've been guilty of this myself, we borrow underwriting models from other people, and then we just try to manipulate some of the numbers. And oftentimes what ends up happening is some things are hard coded, some things are feeding from other cells, and it ends up being a bit of just a mishmash, if you will. And the whole thing is getting thrown off by a number that's being fed. And because you haven't taken the time to understand every single cell in that underwriting model, one little thing can get amplified, or maybe you're missing a cost, or you're just not properly underwriting the model because you never built it, or you never took the time to understand it. And I can tell you that I've made this mistake, and now I have gone through. It's taken me a week to build one model from scratch, but I understand everything. On other models, I go back and even though I've tried to simplify, sometimes it has to get a little bit bigger, because your financial model is really how you're making your business decision, your investing decisions. And I've just seen it way too many times, especially when I used to coach them, when I would help people, they would send me their models. And what was shocking is the number of times that they would have cells that weren't feeding properly. And I could figure this out in a matter of a couple of minutes. And yet they're sending these to banks, they're sending them to investors. I've never necessarily been that sloppy, but I've missed certain line items in my budgets and costs because they were not properly coded. And, like I said, that's why it's nice to have a big contingency, because you want to be able to make sure that if you do miss something, look, mistakes are going to happen. I mean, that's just the nature of doing developments. But you want to control as many of those as possible, so that when you get into a project, that you're starting on solid foundation. You're not starting from quicksand, where every little mistake, now you're going backwards. So here are the 5 mistakes that I've made or seen others make. Overly optimistic, too low margin of safety, wrong team, underestimating contingency, and essentially not starting with a proper model to build your pro forma, okay, and your business plan. So these are, if you just do the opposite, right? Don't be overly optimistic, which would be, I wouldn't say necessarily be pessimistic, but be like an accurate thinker. Have a larger margin of safety, find the right team, make sure you have the proper size contingency, and start with the proper underwriting model. Okay, so those would be the inverse of those 5 mistakes. Now, I don't know if you've followed me on LinkedIn or Twitter, but what I'm starting to do, and we'll see, like this is another test I'm kind of going with this year, and that is I'm sharing more stories. Like obviously I come on here once a week on the podcast and to create these videos, but I'm also sharing kind of daily insights and thoughts that I'm having. And you can check those out on LinkedIn and Twitter. That's it. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time. Bye for now.